Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Artists Live with Dr. Tara Betts and Dr. Eve Ewing. My name is Lee Fagan, Senior Director of Programming and Engagement here at the Reva and David Logan Center for the Arts at the University of Chicago. This program is organized in conjunction with the exhibition Truth and Beauty in the Hard Places, on view at Cafe Logan in the Logan Center. The exhibition represents a culmination of year-long residencies by creatives Tara Betts, the inaugural poet for the people, and Ronaldo Hudson, inaugural artist for the people, both practitioners in residence at the Center for the Study of Race, Politics, and Culture and the Posen Center for Human Rights Lab at the University of Chicago. To quote Tara Betts about the show, hopefully these works will encourage you to explore the possibilities of hope, truth, and beauty, even in those places and moments where we think none of those concepts seem possible. For those of you who haven't seen the exhibition, it will be up until April 1st. And that evening, we will be hosting a closing in-person event on that Friday evening with Ronaldo and Tara in conversation with Alice Kim and Tracy Matthews. Just to note, the closed captioning is available this evening, and ASL interpretation will be added in the event recording, which will be posted shortly alongside the Artist Live we did with Ronaldo Hudson. I'd like to extend gratitude to our co-sponsors of this evening's event and the exhibition, the Human Rights Lab, the Center for the Study of Race, Politics, and Culture, and the Logan Center. And with that, I will turn it over to my colleague, Emily, to introduce tonight's speakers.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Emily Hooper-Lansana, and I'm thrilled about tonight. So excited for the opportunity to celebrate this conversation between Dr. Eve Ewing and Dr. Tara Betts. I want to tell you a little bit about Artists Live and how it came to be. So several years ago, when I started working at the university and was developing programming ideas, I was interested in creating a conversation series that would allow us not only to examine an artist's work, but to think deeply about the lives that artists lead and about the trajectory perhaps that takes us in our journey as an artist from one space to another. And tonight is one of those Artist Live conversations. Usually when we're having an Artist Live, when we decide the artist who is going to be featured, we ask that artist to tell us who they'd like to be in conversation with. And so in her experience here, as a human rights fellow, when we spoke to Tara about what she wanted to do this evening, she said, I would really love to be in conversation with Eve. And the stars aligned, the schedules aligned, and here we are tonight. So we're thrilled that you are able to join us. I'm going to introduce to you Dr. Tara Betts, who is the author of Break the Habit, Arc and Hue, and the forthcoming Refuse to Disappear. In addition to working as an editor, a teaching artist, and a mentor for other writers, she has taught at several universities. She is the inaugural 2021 Poet for the People Practitioner Fellow with the Posen Center for Human Rights Lab and the Center for the Study of Race, Politics, and Culture at the University of Chicago, and the founder of Whirlwind Learning Center. Betts is currently teaching poetry classes at DePaul University and Northwestern University. She is a force of nature, a wonderful spirit who has a way with words. We're glad to have her in the circle. And tonight she will be in conversation with Dr. Eve Ewing, who is a sociologist of education and a writer from Chicago. She's the award-winning author of 4 books, the poetry collections Electric Arches and 1919, the nonfiction work Ghosts in the Schoolyard, Racism and School Closings on Chicago's South Side, and most recently, a novel for young readers, Maya and the Robot. She has written several projects for Marvel Comics, most notably the Ironheart series, as well as Marvel Team Up and Champions. She is an assistant professor at the University of Chicago Crown Family School of Social Work, Policy, and Practice. Her work has been published in many places, including the New Yorker, the Atlantic, and the New York Times. Currently, she's working on her next book, Original Sins, The Miseducation of Black and Native Children and the Construction of American Racism, which will be published by One World. I want to introduce the event with this quote. Remember this in the darkest moments, when the work doesn't seem worth it and change seems just out of reach. Out of our willingness to push through comes a tremendous power. Use it. That's from Stacey Abrams. Tonight is a moment that we have to gather together when the world in some ways seems dark, but our gathering together is powerful, and we have such powerful voices. Tonight, we celebrate Dr. Tara Betts in conversation with Dr. Eve Ewing. I'm going to turn it over to the two of you.
Yay! Thank you
That
so
was
much.
beautiful.
It was so good. Thank you to Emily and to Lee for having us, and thank you so much, Tara. I'm incredibly moved and grateful that you wanted to be in conversation with me. And for those who don't know, me and Tara Betts go way, way back, and there is no Eve Ewing without Tara Betts at all. And Tara is one of the people who made me feel like it was possible for me to be a writer. So I'm a big believer in giving people their flowers. I hope you know I try to make sure that you know that I love and celebrate you and I'm grateful for you. And why don't we start off by having you read?
Oh, sure. I'm flipping over because I'm on an iPad with us tonight, and I just feel like before I read the poem, I just want to say thank you to everybody who came and everybody who organized this, but also Eve, I really feel like I learned a lot about being a writer by teaching younger writers. That made me more powerful, I feel like. And, you know, I feel like if I do nothing else on this earth, I have done something that I'm very, very proud of by teaching people like you. So I feel really good about that. And I'm so glad you could join me tonight. So I'm going to hush and I'll read a couple poems. I'll read some work that's in the exhibit. So if you can, please check it out. I did a TikTok about this quote because most people do not know that it came not from Kanye West or his mother, Dr. Donda West, but it came from Gwendolyn Brooks. So it felt right for the time and the exhibit, and it's called Are You Ready? Even if you are not ready for the day, it cannot always be night. Gwendolyn Brooks. Even if you are not ready for anything Black, it cannot always be white. Even if you are not ready for the women, it cannot always be the men. Even if you are not ready for the spectrum, it cannot always be a binary. Even if you're not ready for the poor, it cannot always be the rich. Even if you ain't ready for the thickness, it cannot always be a bone. Even if you're not ready for the fight, it cannot always be the dance. Even if you're not ready for the dance, it cannot always be the fight. And even if you're not ready to begin, it cannot always be the end. And I have a poem in the exhibit that's about one of Ronaldo's poems, and I wanted to share that. It's the image that's on the cover of the exhibition catalog, and he really was like, you have to write a poem about this piece. So I'm really glad I had the chance and the honor to do that. It's called Forgotten Women of COVID, after Ronaldo Hudson. Her face fills a small square window in a heavy wooden door, locked into a sentence. Solitary face, half covered by a mask, a piece of cloth and locked door provide little safety. A shadowed heavy opening that she cannot exit, permeated, penetrated by air, water, or ambitious rat, chewing around its corners. Soft tendrils of hair curl, wander to her downcast eyes. She could be in prayer or steeped in resignation, a tea that steams her reddish brown skin into shine like burnished autumn leaf, still capable of catching sun, yellow rays, thread the tiny window framing her face caught behind this sentinel, unearthed from the trees, this door where red streaks the wood's grain, none of the stain from lamb's blood to keep the angel of death at bay. This is a poem. I'll close with this one, and then I'm really delighted to talk with you guys tonight. I really thought about how we're in this world of negative capability where there's horrible things happening all over at the same time. And at the same time, there are beautiful things being created and born while all of that is happening in the maelstrom. And when I thought about it, I thought about Aretha Franklin, and this poem came out. So it's called Think Think. Think about the air invisible as it uncurls a wave of toxins. Think about how its fingertips trace the skin as a baton falls on the flesh merely seconds later. Think about how heavy metals brown the water and we are told to drink. Think about how many of us wonder when the roofs over our heads will be a tongue evicted from the language of home. Think about how every person needs a doctor, but everyone doesn't get one. Think about how savings mean nothing to the crazy fine print circumscribed like obsolete glyphs. Think how law books fall open and hopscotch for anyone who keeps writing checks. Think, like Aretha Franklin belting "What You Trying to Do to Me." Think how the law keeps shuffling the numbers to fit some constant, where acknowledging who is human is posited in some philosophy or some mathematical equation that pretends that logic is its function, when blood needs to find something superior, something that denies how human is defined by a much wider net cast by some divine fisherman, or perhaps an African goddess in a gown laced with sea foam, but place markers for faith are constantly moved toward a crucifix. A human can find more than one path, I hope. Think about how every day someone is hoping for some simple thing, like fresh bread lightly toasted, the ability to walk without pain, a chance to shower, a moment free of fist and jeer, a moment singing victorious, as if we could level the wrongs and leave the world upright like a gospel-drenched woman, singing freedom, freedom after forgiveness, after you change your mind, because you need to think and act to be free.
Bars. Thank you so much, Tara. That was just amazing. It's always great, like when you get to encounter people's new work, you know, and think about it in the durée of the other. So I'm thinking about recurring. I have so much to say on a craft level, but I'm going to set that aside for the time being. I want to ask you actually about something that you said at the beginning of our time together this evening, which is talking about your identity as a teacher. And you are a consummate teacher. I think that there are many artists who find their way into teaching because it's a way to pay the bills. But you are somebody who takes your pedagogy very seriously, and you've taught in a lot of different contexts. Why is being a teacher so important to your identity as a writer? And how do you see those things kind of nestled together?
Well, I mean, for me, part of what got me interested in pedagogy in the first place was just thinking about, how do I explain this thing that I'm excited about, right? And that I want to learn how to do better myself. And I remember early on realizing, I'm like, oh my gosh, this is like a lifelong apprenticeship. I could just spend my life figuring this out. And luckily, I feel like I got my start as a teaching artist in these places where they basically just let me go wild and said, teach what you want to teach how you want to teach it. So I would just try things out and see how they worked. And I also feel like, too, I was really lucky here in Chicago because I got the start in places like Gallery 37.
Sorry, my internet was being haterish. I'm here. Tara, are you still here? Yes, no, maybe so. Am I alone in the world?
You are not alone, but I'm not
Okay.
sure Tara's here.
Okay,
Oh, okay. So it was Tara, not me. I left and came back.
I think everybody got knocked off. We got knocked off and came back on.
Oh, okay.
Hi,
Wow.
Eve.
Hi, Barbara. I was like, I just need a sign of life from somebody. I see Marianne Johnson is there. I don't know Marianne, but I'm grateful to her for confirming that that we are in, that we're here. I see Bill Michaels here. Okay, good. Good.
It
I was
looks
like,
like Tara is reconnecting.
okay,
Hey
great.
guys, I don't know what
Hey,
happened.
it was the ops. It was our ops, Tara.
It was
So
the
you were,
ops.
it was the ops. So
It's
you were
always the
talking about
ops.
Gallery 37. So let's pick up right from there.
Yeah, so I said, I mean, I felt really lucky because I had those teaching experiences in places like Gallery 37 and other organizations where I met kids from different neighborhoods all over the city, from different cultures, different races, and different gender experiences too. Because I felt like that was really, I don't always, I'm still, maybe because I'm a different generation, catching up with the pronouns and being mindful of how to phrase that language. But I've always just been like, you're my students. I'm like, I love you. I don't care where you come from or who you love. You know, I want you to be safe. So, you know, to start with that as my base and to think about how do we get you all in a room to have a conversation? How do we get you to make friends with somebody who we might not have ever seen you being friends with them before, but also be a better writer and a better human being, you know? And I drew a lot from June Jordan from that. Like I thought a lot about that. She did that book, Poetry for the People. And that really shaped a lot of my curriculum early on and thinking about how do I bring those ideas to the table? Because eventually there's some point, even if you teach your whole life, you hope that somebody else is going to continue to teach that way, you know, that you hope that will get people to remember and be better human beings and include as many people as possible in the way to tell a story, you know.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. And for those who don't know the history, you know, Gallery 37 was a youth arts program that for me was my first like legitimate paycheck, you know, and that now has morphed into After School Matters. And I think that really what you're talking about is that part of your work as a teaching artist is helping other young people see artistry in themselves. And I wonder, going back a generation, I love that this conversation is partially about you telling us about the trajectory of your life as an artist. So could you take us back and how did you start identifying as an artist and how did that become a label that you were comfortable claiming? When did you know you were an artist?
Gosh, you know, I started writing poems when I was a little kid. And I think I really knew I wanted to do it probably when I was about 12 or 13, which is funny. I ask a lot of poets that question too, and they tell me about 13. And I think there's something very delicate and tender about that age, right? Where you end up, it's like you're becoming aware of adulthood in ways that you didn't as a tween or somebody who's a little bit younger and in grade school, right? So it's that moment where I was just talking with my students about Richard Hugo and his book, The Triggering Town, and how he starts to talk about you develop.
I haven't thought about that book in a long time. Wow.
I love that book though. I had to tell my students triggering is not what it means today, but it's really valuable because he talks about this idea of the public poet and the private poet. And I think I'm a private poet the way he describes that, you know, because the public poet is always trying to be smart and witty and stay on top of what people want to hear and what they want to talk about. And the private poet is thinking about what does that language mean to you? What do those words mean to you on an emotional and remembering level, right? And can you make other people see that translation of the language as opposed to just trying to say, like, I think you can be both a public poet and a private poet, but you need to think about how your emotional landscape informs whatever subject you decide to tackle. And that's definitely one of the things that I found myself thinking about early on, even though I didn't have that language for it. Like, I want to tell the truth about things. I want to explore these things that shape the lives of the people that I love that aren't included in books. Like, because when I was a kid, there were no books about people who had a Black parent and a white parent. There were no books about Black history that were taught in schools. You maybe saw a picture of Martin Luther King or Gwendolyn Brooks in your textbook if you were lucky, you know? So those things really, you know, and God forbid if you were looking for anybody else, like a Native American person or a Mexican person or an Asian person, you'd be like, where are they? I see them in real life. They're not in this book, you know? So I think those questions really fueled me early on to think a lot about the picture I wanted and needed as a student, and said, well, what if I wrote something like that? You know?
That's really powerful. And this word that you use, translation, I think to me captures what is great about your poetry. And like everybody has their own opinion of what makes a great poem. For me, part of what I'm striving for as a poet and what I think is a great poet is exactly what you said, telling the truth, right? And how can you get people to understand the way that you felt in that moment, or the way that you felt when you saw that thing, right? I think about somebody like Ross Gay, and you know, a lot of his poetry, one of his most famous poems is like walking down the street and seeing this fig tree on the corner, and this fig tree is like overly abundant with figs. It's just doing the most. This tree is doing the most, right? And like, how do you get people to understand that, how you felt when you saw this tree that was like going all in, you know? And I love that. I love that about the work that you just read for us tonight. I love that about your work in general. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit just about your family and how they've influenced your writing life. And that can be chosen family, biological family, whatever family you want to talk about.
Gosh, I feel like, you know, as somebody who is like, my parents are both gone, my grandparents are gone, and I have no biological children, I'm really, the one thing I constantly remind myself is that I've really been blessed to kind of build family in places where I just I didn't have that same connection. Like, I have my brothers, I have two nephews, and sometimes, you know, I touch base with them, but we don't live in the same place. So it's really challenging at times. But my family and my writing life has been so rich and so varied. I have students I taught here in Chicago, students I taught in New York, um, students I've taught in different workshops. A lot of students stay in touch with me. And that's been really invaluable because, you know, at a certain point, you know, you have your role as a teacher. And it's nice when you can drop that role a little bit. Like, be like, we're going to go out and have margaritas and we're going to talk about poetry. Because I don't, you know, when I taught here in Chicago for a long time, I was like, I'm not even drinking with students, you know, because they're young. But now I'm a grown up and they're grown up. So you can go, okay, let's go have this real conversation. And, you know, you can kind of be a little bit of more of yourself. So I can do that with some of my students who are like in their 30s now, which I couldn't do before.
Right. You're a grand teacher now. You've taught people who teach, like, I'm old enough that I can drink with some of my former students, and so you're out here.
Right. It's kind of nice, right?
Different.
Like,
and I also
want to be responsible
say,
and be a role model, but
right.
you don't want to go overboard.
And you also, I mean, on a serious note, I think that you as a teacher actually had a healthier sense of, I mean, I think you were kind of before your time in thinking about boundaries and appropriate, like even you saying like, well, this is what I thought was appropriate as a teacher. That's not what everybody was doing at the time, right? And I feel very grateful to you for that. And you know, and you have impacted so many, you have so many former students that are as your children, right? Your literary children. I saw Elizabeth Acevedo today, who's a, you know, who, for folks who don't know, a very esteemed DC writer. And she was like, Tara Betts, you did an event with Tara Betts. I loved her. She was so kind to me, right? That was her memory of you. She was so kind to me as a young person. And so that's your reputation in the streets. And I think that that's something to be really proud of. That is a family that you kind of build for yourself.
And that means a lot to me. You know, I remember thinking a lot just about that idea of how do I get young people to think about being creative, but also realizing that creative doesn't have to be toxic. It doesn't have to be a thing where you neglect your health. There are some things I wish I was better at working out. Like, I always admire that you're out running and doing all the things, but I'm just like, I need to work out. But like, so many of the things that we've been taught about being an artist means not taking care of ourselves or doing self-destructive things. And I was like, yo, we don't got to do that. We do not have to. And I said it vocally then, and I'll say it vocally now. And I was like, I'm so glad that self-care and mental health issues and all of this stuff has become a public conversation, because I didn't have the language for it at the time, but I knew that's what it was. I knew even when I left New York and I went to go teach kids in New York and New Jersey, I was like, I don't have the language for this, but I know I need to be in therapy. I know I need to be walking. I know I need to be meditating. Like, leaving Chicago kind of gave me that space to expand and really build on that in some ways that I couldn't before. And it's helped me build those other family circles. Like, I live in a building where I have a friend of mine, before he had kids, we went to open mics together, like more than 20 years ago, before I was teaching artist. And now his kids are in college, and they're like my nephews too, but we also get together and write. Or we go to my friend Lydia, who writes mystery novels. We go to her house and we write, and then I go there, and it's like, they're kind of like, they're not parents. Lydia is not a parent. She's definitely a homie, but she's a little bit older than me. So it's nice to have that older energy and that younger energy, and have that. I need that. I think it keeps you human. It keeps you grounded, and you need that, because people get out in the world and think they're fancy, and then you go home and realize, yeah, you might need to wash some dishes.
You don't have anybody. And I think that's so real. It's like, when it comes down to it, who's really there for you and who's really waiting for you back home, and
Right.
how do you build that for yourself? Yeah, that's really powerful. I put in the chat, people need to write down creativity doesn't always have to be toxic, especially for Black people and especially for Black women, right? That we are kind of told that working through our trauma on the page is how we find value, and there are other ways. I want to. There's a quotation that our mutual friend of a long time, Nate Marshall, said to me, and he said this once and probably forgot it, but it lives forever because I quote it all the time. Where he told me, the greatest thing a poem or a poet can give is permission. And you talked about June Jordan as a poet who gave you permission. Who are some of the other writers who have given you permission that make you feel like, okay, I can do this. I can do this in this way, either in the past or the present?
Gosh, that's a lot of poets, girl. Oh my God. I would probably say the people who immediately come to mind, I'd say Sonia Sanchez, Marilyn Nelson, Nikki Finney, Pablo Neruda gave me a lot of permission, because I felt like he celebrated everything. He celebrated his country, his people, his politics, socks, French fries. Like, the odes always make me so happy because of that. Sharon Olds, because she gives you permission to take risks and talk about these things that everyone is scared to say. I'm trying to look more, not just at the people who came before me, but also looking at younger poets too. I really love Dinez's work. They've been doing amazing stuff. I was reading Destiny Birdsong's book, Negotiations, and the opening poem is so fierce. The first time I was reading it, I was just like, I looked at it, I said, I'm not ready. And I just put the book down. And that's what I want. I read a lot of books, but I want a book that makes me look at it and go, okay, I need to read this either a poem at a time or a little bit at a time, because I know I'm going to be mad when it's done, or it's just saying something that I'm like, You know, you just don't, you can't even vocalize.
Right.
Because
You
it
just have
hit
to
the
put it
point,
down.
you know, and I mean, you can read widely, but I do think sometimes you're looking for that book that just hits that spot, that little sweet Netherland that nobody can really articulate in the way that you would love to articulate it. You know?
Yes. And I love, I mean, you keep a very active reading life, which I think is important. And I think a lot of people don't realize how crucial that is.
Right.
But you've also had a very full writing life. So for those who don't know, you know, and I freaked you out a little bit by saying this before we got on the call, but your first chapbook came out in 1999. Can I Hang was the title. And I wanted to know, in what ways are you the same poet as you were then? In what ways are you different? In what ways are you the same person as you were then? And in what ways are you different? Tara Betts, this is your life. So we're here to answer the hard question.
First off, if you have that chapbook, hold on to it.
Yeah, I don't have it. But if anyone else out there, I have a shoebox of rare chapbooks that I like to use to embarrass people, but I don't have that one. That's before my time.
Well, I'm not embarrassed by it. Some of the poems I'm kind of like, yeah, they could have been better. But there's some poems in there I'm like, it hasn't done bad, you know?
Sure.
But I only printed 300 copies of those at a Kinkos in Chicago. I don't even remember where.
It was probably that North Avenue Kinkos. That's my guess.
Maybe, probably.
That used to be the Kinkos.
That used to be the Kinkos, yeah, and it's still there. But in terms of, God, that's been 23 years, Eve. That's been a long time.
Jordan years.
It doesn't feel like it's been that long, and I feel like I should be doing more. I still feel like that, but you know, I think I've always felt that. You feel that urge and that push. So when you finish one book, then you're like, okay, I'm done with that. What's the next thing? You know, and I love that I haven't lost that impulse. But in terms of the chapbooks, I think that was my initial education into thinking about how to publish a book. So there were mistakes I made on it, you know, because I did the layout with a friend and, you know, took it to the printer myself. And, you know, then you're like, oh God, that picture didn't reproduce well. Oh, I didn't do this, you know. So you have a sense and you compare it with like books that you see and books that you enjoy and you go, oh, so this is what a book. So when I went into doing an actual book, I felt like I had a sense of what was supposed to work better when I did that. And my other chapbook switch. So I was really happy that I did that. And it kind of built my confidence because it felt like something I could give to people and say, look, I'm really a poet. I'm really a writer, you know, as opposed to you go to a bunch of open mics or readings or you go teach a little class for, you know, middle school kids. And then they go, how are you a poet? You don't even got a book out because, you know, middle school kids will treat you.
Well, you know, I was giving away, at the beginning of COVID, I was giving away a bunch of books outside in front of Burke Elementary. We're giving them out for free. And somebody said, oh, you couldn't sell them, huh? Man,
because that's how they'll do you.
I was like, wow, thank you. Kept me real humble that day. Oh, you couldn't sell these, huh? You giving them away. I was like,
yeah.
Blessings.
I feel like if you're an author and you can get middle school kids to ride with you, then you are bad. You know
yes, ma'am. Yes,
like,
ma'am.
I don't care how famous you are, you better be like
yeah.
ready.
I thought that was so funny. But and what about as a person? I mean, what about when you look back at Tara at the Kinkos, you know, how in what ways does she feel familiar to you? In what ways does she feel unfamiliar or different to you?
Well, I think the one thing that definitely feels familiar is that as I was doing that process, I said, you are keeping that promise to your 12-year-old self, your 13-year-old self. Because I knew I wanted to be a writer and I knew I wanted to write books. I was just like, you have to want it so much. Like, just want it. And I was like, you're keeping that promise. And that felt so good. Like, when I think about it now, I'm like, what would I tell that girl if I saw her now? And there's so many things that I want to tell her, right? And so that definitely feels familiar, that you can say you kept the promise, Bets. You kept the promise. And then the thing that makes me feel unfamiliar is sometimes I just feel like I know more, I've read more, I've traveled more, but I'm like, sometimes it doesn't feel new, and you got to find ways to keep things new for yourself and not be jaded and irritated by all the things that happen in the world, you know. And that's a hard balance to strike. I think, you know, especially if you go through some things, you're trying to figure out how to make that happen and stay hopeful and optimistic, and you know, seeking that kind of balance is hard.
Yeah, how do you stay curious, not be jaded, right? But keep learning new things about the world.
Right.
I want to say to our assembled esteemed audience that, just as a heads up, in a few minutes, I'm going to open up if you have questions. So if you have a question, this is a good time to start formulating it. You can write it in the chat if you want, or I think we'll probably stick with that because we have a pretty big group. So if you have a question you want to write it in the chat now, I'll come back to it in a few minutes, but just wanted to give folks a heads up. So speaking of learning and changing and growing, there's a very famous Zora Neale Hurston quote, who Zora, among the many other things she told us, there are years that ask questions and years that answer. And for you, are you in a year that is asking or answering? And what are the questions or the answers, if you don't mind sharing some of it? So I guess two-part question. First, are you in a year that asks questions right now, or that answers or do not know yet? And then would you share with us what some of those questions or answers might be?
Is it fair to say I think it's a year that's doing both?
Sure.
Because
I mean, she's not here, so you can say whatever you want. It's just us.
All right. So Miss Hurston, wherever you are, this year is doing both. And I'm so glad she has a book out this year. And I wish she could have seen that book come out in her lifetime.
I know.
For me, I think this year is finally answering in some ways that is like, yes, you are capable and competent in ways you did not think you were. But as far as the questions, it's like, what do you want to do next? Where do you see yourself in the next few years? Who do you want to be with? Who do you want to keep? And who are you willing to let go? Like, I've been thinking a lot about that, and what's been holding me back. Because I think, you know, that was part of why I left Chicago. I said I needed to leave because it would always be like a what if. And there was, you know, I feel like the difference between the generation of writers you're in and the generation I was in is that we felt like we had to leave because you would never go anywhere.
Never make it.
And now that's changing, which is the beauty of it. Because I'm like, I did not want to live on the East Coast anymore. It did not feel like Chicago. No offense to my East Coast people, but it's not home. It doesn't speak to the rhythms of my body and my comfort levels. And I'm just like, it's changing a little bit, but it's not the same. And I'm really glad to see that this younger generation of artists is saying we're not leaving and we're still gonna blow up. And I feel like that was kind of the energy that made me hang on and stay and not leave right away. I wish we had more intergenerational conversations like this, which is another reason why I wanted to talk with you. You know, we have to have that where we don't just talk to our elders, we talk to the people who are behind us in some time that might be here a little bit longer than us. You know, we have to have that because we miss so much. The context isn't there. There's not like a bridge being built. And I'm like, we need that, you know, not in the Kate Rushing kind of way, but, you know.
Just in a relational way. I mean, just to be able to learn from one another and to also to have a foundation of, because people are going to disagree, right? And people are going to have different perspectives on things. And how can we build on relationships as an opportunity to learn and grow and to, as Mariam Kaba says, use conflict as a resource, right? Rather
Right.
than, dismissing of people.
Mhm.
I'm going to ask you another question. And then if folks have questions for the chat, folks have questions for Tara, this would be a great time to put them in the chat, and I will pull them out for us.
Sounds good.
So I loved reading your essay about Ronaldo Hudson's visual art. And again, for folks who haven't gotten a chance to see it, please do go check it out. The link is in the chat to see it at the Logan Center. One of the things I appreciated about your essay was your discussion of how you've been trying to keep yourself afloat in the last 2 years, and your own judiciousness around, like, you know what, certain things are not good for me. Let me go to this Alice Coltrane instead. What are some of the healing practices that are important to you?
For me, I found myself not just purging a lot of stuff, but I was starting to meditate. I've been letting go of not trying to do everything. I couldn't bring myself to do it anymore. I mean, because I think one of the things that nobody talks about being in a PhD program is you feel pressured to work all the time. You feel pressured to be at all the meetings. You feel pressured to be at all the readings. You feel pressure to teach your classes, answer all the emails, be in service to your students, be in service to your school. And I was trying to do that, particularly when I was at UIC. And then I would come home and be like, I'm working on a book chapter for publication. Then I'm going to fly out for a conference. Then I'm going to come home and do this reading. And such asked me for a recommendation. And it felt like it was too much. And as soon as I couldn't go anywhere, I realized, I was like, this is not healthy for me. It's not. And then to still realize that, as women of color in the academy system, you're evaluated differently, and you don't get to say certain things. You don't get to be included in the conversation all the time. And I'm still not tenured, I'm still trying to figure out, where can I be in this system? Like right now I'm in an office at DePaul, but I'm not contracted to be here indefinitely, you know. So it definitely says a lot to me about this system, that I just did. I was like, you got to be willing to let that go. And what do you envision yourself doing with all the skills that you have? And I think meditating has been really helpful for that. And just saying, if someone doesn't want what I have to give, I can give it to somebody else. I can do that, and that will be okay. And just, approving that that is okay has been a huge hurdle for me. And then naps, I was not sleeping. I was getting used to sleeping 5 or 6 hours a night. I'm like, no, we deserve and need more sleep, which is one of the cool things about the nap ministry that I'm so glad that's become part of the public conversation too.
Well, because people don't know, Trisha used to be here, so
Yeah, she was a
another
Chicagoan as
Chi-Town
well.
original. So we claim her.
Yeah, everybody else just caught up.
Yeah, exactly. We've been on the Trisha train, but no, I really appreciate you saying that. I think that so many people, especially writers, because oftentimes to make a living as a writer, you are cobbling together these different things. And I've heard versions of this from so many people, like, wow, I really had to reevaluate, my relationship to time, my relationship to rest. And I really appreciate you just modeling that and talking openly about it. And am grateful for that. I am seeing, okay, here's a question from Sheila. Sheila says, a few years ago, I'm going to do my best Sheila voice. I don't actually know Sheila, but Sheila, I hope I can do justice with my dramatic performance of your question. Sheila says, a few years ago, the results of an NEA survey, a National Endowment for the Arts survey, indicated that more people were reading poetry, and the percentage of people in the US who read poetry continues to rise. Eve and Tara, why do you think that's happening? I'm going to let you answer that because it's your night, and then maybe I'll chime in. Thank you, Sheila.
I think there's a lot of reasons, and I'll start with this. One, poetry looks like more like America now than it ever has. which means it is not all the dead old white men. It is not just men. It is, and it's people across the spectrum. And I'm just thinking, wow, like it took that kind of rocket science for y'all to figure that out. And then also too, there's, like I think about Dana Gioia's book, Does Poetry Matter? And I remember the first time I read that book, I was teaching here in Chicago almost 20 years ago. And he's talking about, well, we need poets going to the schools and going to the communities and get kids to write and share poems with them. I said, that's what we've been doing.
We've been doing that, right?
So that was 20 years ago, right? And I'm like, what is Dana talking? And then I realized, I said, oh, he's talking about teaching the classics, teaching from the foundational canonical works, which are all questionable in terms of, is that everybody's foundation? Is that everybody's canon? So there's that, but then also we've had the rise of slams. We've had the rise of television shows like Lyrics and Flow and Lyric Cafe. It was Lyric Cafe, Def Poetry Jam. There was like a rash of those shows where people saw poetry on television. And now we've seen poets on like talent shows and in commercials. And I think it's not a hard point to see where that evolution has come from. And I'm kind of glad that people are starting to step away from that page versus stage argument that a lot of journalists have just worn down the poor little dead horse. And, it's like, you can see, it's like, there's no division between the two. If the writing is strong, the writing is going to speak for itself, whether it's on the air or on the page.
Yeah, I would co-sign everything you said. I mean, I think that the page versus stage thing is so played, but I do think that, I think about somebody like Dinez, who you mentioned earlier, who, for those who don't know, is Dinez Smith, probably one of the greatest, I would say one of the greatest living American poets. I'm gonna say that. I'm gonna put that out there and say, I'm gonna claim it for Dinez. And you should look them up and being a National Book Award finalist suggests that I'm not the only person who thinks that might be the case. But I think about myself or you or Dinez, that all of us came to poetry at least partially through these performance spaces. And right. I think that that's because that I don't consider myself a slam poet. I've never been a slam poet, but slam and slam spaces and open mic performance spaces are integral to how I came to poetry. And and I think that those doors were open for people like us when a lot of the traditional doors were not. I remember, I took one college poetry class ever in my life. And I took an American poetry class of like modern American poetry at the University of Chicago. It was not a creative writing class. Where there was to be no writing of the poetry. Okay, we're only going to talk about the poetry, just going to study the poetry. And I remember, I don't think I've ever felt so deeply alienated in a college classroom in my life, where what was being discussed, what was being said, what was on the syllabus, the way people were talking about what poetry was, and how to become a poet. And, this professor was like, well, the way you become a poet is you get your MFA, you go to poetry school and you get your poetry deal. And I thought, well, I know a lot of poets, and a lot of the poets I know didn't do that stuff, And so I think that through performance spaces, Black people, queer people, disabled people, other people of color, immigrants, undocumented people, all these folks who didn't necessarily see themselves in that type of canon have come through. And then it turns out when you let those people through the doors, we write bomb poems that people want to read. That are good and enticing and interesting and relatable to people. So I think that has played a big role. I also think the internet has been good to poetry. Poetry is compared to, people aren't going to get on Instagram and read a novel. But you can read some pretty decent poems in one or two swipes. So so I'm grateful to be living through this time. We have a couple other really good questions. I want to ask a question from Alice Kim, who asks about your experience teaching poetry at Stateville Correctional Center, where I have in one term had the pleasure of sharing a classroom wall with you, where we were
Yeah, we sure did.
classroom neighbors. And I could hear you sometimes and be like, I wonder what they're doing. I wonder what they're talking about over there. For those who don't know, Tara has been a longtime collaborator with the Prison and Neighborhood Arts Project. I think it's a project, Prison Neighborhood Arts Project, and has been a very valued and widely beloved instructor at Stateville, which is a maximum security correctional center downstate Illinois. So could you talk about that particular experience? And you've taught in juvenile detention as well, I believe.
Yeah, I did.
So you've done a lot of teaching in carceral spaces. So could you just talk a little bit about that experience and why that's something you keep going back to over and over?
Well, honestly, I wish I was back at Stateville, because at this point, we can't go in to teach. They've been on medical lockdown indefinitely because of COVID. I know at least 2 of my previous students have died from COVID. And emotionally, that's been really challenging, because I just remember them, like in general, when you have a really positive and engaging classroom experience, when something like that happens, Alice is saying we just got the okay to go back inside. And it was different trying to teach via correspondence, because it's monitored differently. I was not always getting correspondence as of recently when I was teaching. And I miss hearing their voices and seeing their expressions and reading together, because I've found not just in me reading to them or them reading to me, that we understand the work in a different way sometimes, or they understand it better. And we start asking each other questions like, wait a second, would you have said that way? Like, and it was like, there's no organic kind of discussion when you have to just write letters back and forth. And I'm sure those letters are valuable. So if you know someone who is incarcerated, write to them. They need that. I mean, especially now, because they're not getting the same kind of contact with the outside world and with other people that you need to kind of just maintain. And I think that's one of the things that's been the most challenging, is knowing, when I was teaching via correspondence recently, that I don't know if they even got that. They don't, or they think I forgot about them, or I don't care, and you don't, as a teacher, that's one of the things you want to never happen, So that's been on my mind a lot. But my experiences teaching there have been better than some of my graduate student classes. I tell people all the time, because they're excited to be there.
Yeah, it's the best. I mean, in terms of the level of conversations, the engagement, the close reading, it's the best teaching. I mean, I think everybody who's taught at Stateville says that. And we've taught at you've taught everywhere that and I've taught everybody. I think the youngest class I've ever taught is 4 years old. So but it's the best. I think the most painful part is not being able to see people out, not being able to walk out with people,
Right.
And I also want to say, I think in terms of giving people flowers, I want to thank you, because I feel like you have being able to go in with you has been a tether for me, has been a thing that helps me be able to even walk in and walk out, because it's a very hard thing to do. It's very hard.
Yeah.
It's almost hard to ask what's harder, walking in or walking out. But
Yeah.
I want to take the prerogative, even though we haven't. I'm gonna do right by Emily and ask Emily's question. Then I'll take the prerogative to ask my final question. So Emily's question is: what are the spaces where you want to take poetry now? Where do you see your work going?
Ooh. Oh my God. Well, I gotta say, some of the work that you've done and what I've seen other poets do, like Destiny, Elizabeth, Julian David Randall, who's out on tour for his new YA novel, and I'm so happy for him.
Right. Everybody needs to check out his brand new book, Pilar Ramirez, amazing
Yes.
new YA novel.
From
a great Chicagoan.
Man, it's set in Chicago and it's got a Dominican girl as the hero. So I'm just like, yes. Anyway, Uh, so I've been thinking a lot about that, like genre jumping. And I love collaborating with people. Like I was telling Ronaldo recently, I said, I've collaborated with a choreographer, visual artists, and musicians. But what would it look like if I started to write plays? What would it look like if I do a YA novel? What would it look like if I worked with more filmmakers? Because I did a short with Nijla Mumin, the sister who did the movie Jen. I hope I'm saying her name right. I'm like, oh God. But anyway, Miss Mumin, we did a short from one of the poems in my first book, Arc and Hue. And I was just like, I want to do more like that. Because I think it's one thing to have the books so that you know that the scholars can find you at some point and that people can read you and that book can travel where your voice can't. But then sometimes you want the voice to travel in other mediums because people are more prone to look at a YouTube. They're more prone to watch something on television. They're more prone to look at art. All of those things speak to people in different ways. And again, I mean, I was just really glad I had this opportunity with U of C to do this residency and be in conversation with Alice and Tracy and Ronaldo and Lee and all the people working with Lee, because it made me think about it in other ways and how to make it more accessible. But I do want to genre jump too. Like I have these ideas. They're percolating.
Join us on the dark side.
If I hit you for advice, you know why.
Please do. Well, you're a great prose writer. I mean, you're an excellent prose writer. I love reading your prose. You know, you're an excellent essayist. So we're all waiting. You know, Monica Cosby was in the chat saying maybe some theater. I would come to the Tara Betts one woman show. Absolutely. I will buy, I'll buy the first ticket, sit in the front row.
I might need an actor to act. I can't.
No, just do, we'll workshop it. I'm going to ask you one final question, which is, what are you dreaming of these days? What, and you can take that as literally, however you interpret dreams. What are your dreams these days that you can share with us?
Ronaldo's probably going to laugh, but I would say I dream of love. What are manifestations of love? And not just romantic love, but like, I can't remember, it's a Jill Scott video, but it's an old Jill Scott video where she's got like a family and it's a house with a porch and you see she falls in love with somebody and they grow old together and they get married and they have kids and then the kids come to the house and visit and then there's kids and friends and the group just gets bigger over time. And I was like, yeah, that was the picture I wanted, and I kind of still want that in some ways, but I'm also like, I came out of that early experience as a teaching artist where I dreamed of that looking not just like people in my family. It might have been living my life like it's golden, but thank you, Monica. But I don't want it to just be people I'm biologically related to or married to. I want it to be like, I want to be like Dr. Margaret Burroughs, where she was, in her 90s out roller skating or walking around the block and people on the block be like, Dr. Burroughs, how you doing? Dr. Burroughs, I got that job. It's so good to see. Like, I want to be that person. And I'm just like, I think I got a long way to go, but it's a dream. I dream about it. I dream about stacks of books with my name on the spine too. And being more rambunctious than I am now.
Well, I think all great dreams, like you say that you're far away from that now, but all great dreams, we live into them day by day, right? Like it comes true in the daily doing. And so I'm so glad that I had an opportunity to talk with you and to celebrate you and to let you know that you are loved and you are important and to talk about your life and to ask you invasive questions in front of strangers. So thank you so much, Tara. And thank you to Lee and to the Posen Center and to Emily and to Logan Center and to any other centers or people that I may be forgetting. And of course to Ronaldo and the incredible work that sparked your incredible work. And so I hope that people will go check it out. And I'm grateful for you.
Thank you. And I'm always so happy to see you. I wish I saw more of you, but I'm glad you're doing good things. Even if I don't see you, it makes me happy and proud.
Thank you. I
And thank you
appreciate you.
everybody else, like everybody who came out and made this happen. It warms my heart, and I'm really affirmed that we're doing things we need to do in the world.
Amen.
Even now in
And
crazy
resting
times.
and taking breaks and getting sleep
Yes.
as well.
I'm
Thank
on nap
you
very
both
soon.
so much
Yes.
for this beautiful, inspiring conversation. I hope that everyone who hasn't had a chance to come see the exhibition will come see it. And if you've seen it, I hope before it closes, you'll come back and bring a friend. I hope that you all will put the upcoming events on your calendar to hear the final conversation with Tara, Ronaldo, Tracy, and Alice. And I just want to close with Tara's quote that is in the guide for the exhibition that says, even if you're not ready to begin, it cannot always be the end. It is the end of our evening today, but I hope that you are inspired to begin something. Tonight was inspiring conversation for me, and I hope you all were inspired as well. Thank you for coming.